Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining our Hitchhikers exclusive webinar, Upgrade Your Search with Yext's latest algorithm update. I'm really excited for this one. As you all know or may know, after our seasonal releases, we have a series of deep dive content into some of our headline items. And one of the items that we're going to dive into today is our latest algorithm update, the Nebula algorithm update. So we've got a really good cast on the line to talk with you through some of these different areas of the algorithm update and how they can factor into how you're using Yext. On the line, we've got two members of our Answers product management team, Alex Yang and Max Davish, and then we've also got Jesse Smith from Platform Product Marketing. So you've got all the experts on the line. If you do have any questions, definitely feel free to pop those into the Q&A module, and we'll be sure to get to as many of those as we can at the end. Without further ado, I will turn it over to Jesse to kick us off.
Awesome, thank you, Nick. And one note I just wanted to make is that, even though today we're here to talk about the Nebula algorithm update, highly encourage you all to check out all of the amazing new features that we've released and that are available in early access from the spring release, from all answers features to listings and more. Check it out, it's chock full of great things we'd love for you to learn more about. So as for our agenda today, first, we're going to cover the Nebula algorithm update. Then you'll get a deep dive in the vertical ranking model from Alex. And then you will get a deep dive from functions and query rules from Max Davish. And then we'll take some questions. So as for the Nebula algorithm update, first, I just want to take a step back here and talk about how at Yext we do release major updates to our answers algorithms several times a year to ensure that we're constantly creating better, more intelligent search experiences across the web. And that's because building a powerful algorithm is an iterative process. Over time, it's important to improve performance across certain types of data, add new machine learning capabilities, support new features, and handle brand new use cases. So here I'm just showing you the last 3 algorithm updates, but we've been constantly iterating our algorithm for the past 3 years. And so today we're going to focus on Nebula from the spring 22 release. And so as for what that includes, so at a high level, it includes the vertical ranking model, which, like I said, we'll do a deep dive of, including intents, biases, and thresholds. We'll talk about functions and query rules. And then the third major update here is language updates. So we now support French and German in extractive QA, as well as French, German, and Spanish in semantic text search. And now I will hand it over to Alex.
Thanks, Jesse, and thanks everyone for joining. Let me go ahead and share my screen here. So the first feature for the spring release that I want to talk about is the vertical ranking model. So in the spring release, we made some, I think, really powerful improvements to our answers algorithm around how we rank the relevance of verticals. So vertical ranking is all about how we decide the most helpful order of verticals to return for a particular query. So how do we know, for example, that a query for shoes should return a products vertical first, but a query for return my shoes should return FAQs first? So if we were to do this purely based on keyword, it's possible that a query for return my shoes will return FAQs first just because of that keyword, or excuse me, will return products first just because of that keyword match. So in the spring release, we introduced a brand new machine learning model, which is purely dedicated to determining the relevance of verticals based on the user's query, and then ranking those verticals in the search results. So the way that this machine learning model works is every vertical is now assigned a relevance score, which I'll go into a little bit more detail about. And then we also introduced a whole bunch of new configuration options that this model accepts, which lets you affect the vertical ranking and fine tune the vertical ranking for your particular set of queries. So starting off at the back end of how this model works, as I mentioned before, every vertical in an answer search now receives a score from 0 to 1, which indicates how relevant Answers thinks that vertical is for a particular query. So this number is based on the same embedding technology that we use for semantic text search, where, for example, for semantic text search, we can compare a query to an FAQ and determine how relevant that FAQ is for the query. In the case of our vertical ranking model, we are now comparing the query to things like the name of the vertical, any filters applied on the vertical, the top result returned in each vertical, and so on. A whole bunch of different clues that together the vertical ranking model can use to assess how relevant that vertical is for a particular query. So that's the starting point. Every vertical in an answer search receives a score from 0 to 1 that indicates its relevance to a query. So how then do you actually configure vertical ranking? How is the final ranking actually determined? Well, for that, we added 3 new configuration properties to answers that you can use to fine tune your vertical ranking. So the first 2 that I'll talk about are thresholds and biases. So thresholds are minimum score requirements that you can set on each vertical, which is the minimum score that that vertical has to achieve in order to be returned at all of the results. So for example, let's say, this FAQs vertical here receives a score of 0.1, but then I set a threshold of 0.2 on that vertical. Well, in that case, the FAQs vertical won't return. Thresholds are really good ways to assert when verticals should return or not. Like if, for example, you only want a vertical to return if there's a very strong match with a query, you could set a very high threshold on that vertical, and that would essentially achieve what you're looking for. The other part of configuring the vertical ranking score is this concept of a bias. So a bias is an adjustment that you can make directly to a vertical score, which affects its final ranking. So for example, you can see here, after checking the thresholds, the locations and the product verticals have the same score of 0.8. Well, in this case, let's say when this kind of situation arises, I want to favor the products vertical because I think, that's the vertical that users are most often looking for. That's the vertical that's most likely to drive conversion. Well, if I want to achieve that, I can apply a positive bias on the products vertical, and that number gets directly added to the vertical score, and then at the end of the day affects the final ranking of the verticals. So those are 2 of the configuration options that we added for vertical ranking. The third is vertical intents. So vertical intents are phrases that you can directly associate with each vertical, which gets factored into that vertical's semantic score. So vertical intents are really helpful for providing additional context around verticals, maybe certain phrases or certain brand specific terms, which you want to ensure will return that vertical first. So for example, if I have an events vertical, maybe I want to ensure that the term developer meetups returns the events vertical first. So this is what vertical intents is all about. So for all this, let me give a quick demo. Exit out full screen here. So to demo this, I set up a copy of our Hitchhiker's experience, which you can find at hitchhikers.yext.com. You can see here we have a whole bunch of different great verticals like app directories, events, help articles, and so on. So I'll walk through a few searches and I'll walk through how I'll use these new properties to affect the vertical ranking for this search. So let's say I place a search for answers. You can see here the events vertical returns first, with a whole bunch of events that are related to answers. But let's say in general, I think the Hitchhiker modules vertical should appear first. That's official content that we publish. It's the content that I see most people clicking on. Well, if I want to achieve that, one thing I can do is I can go to the Hitchhiker module vertical, and I can, let's say, add a positive bias of 0.2 in the Hitchhiker module vertical. Hit save. Place the search one more time. You can see the Hitchhiker module vertical now appears first. Now, an important concept to understand is that just because I have a positive bias on the module vertical, that doesn't mean that that vertical will always appear first in search. If I place a query that's similar enough, let's say I take the name of this first event here, and I place it as a search. You can see the similarity between the query and that event is enough to overcome the bias that I had set on the Hitchhiker module vertical. So biases are just used to favor certain verticals, but it doesn't assert that that vertical should always appear first. So that's biases. Now let's say, looking at this search, this app directory result isn't super relevant. It seems to only be returning because of a keyword match. And in general, I only want app directory results to return if there's a very strong match, if I know somebody is definitely looking for an app directory result. Well, in that case, I can go to app directories. I could set a high threshold on this vertical, let's say 0.7. Hit save and place the search again. And what you'll see is that the query and that app directory vertical are not similar enough to exceed that threshold. And as a result, the app directory result no longer returns in the search. But that being said, if I, let's say, place a search for that particular app directory result that I was just looking at, you can see the vertical now does return because the similarity is enough to overcome the threshold that I had set on that vertical. So that's the thresholds. The last example I'll give is, let's say I place a search for apps. You can see this doesn't return the app directory vertical, most likely because we haven't established the association between the word apps and app directory. So if I wanted to solve this in the app directory vertical, I could create a vertical intent apps, hit save. This might take 1 or 2 refreshes to go through. Oh, there you go. So now the app directory result returns because we've associated the query apps with the app directory vertical. So that's a quick demo of all the different configuration options that you have for vertical ranking now and how our new model works. If you want more details about how the model works, you can see that in the individual search logs for any of these searches. We now provide you a breakdown of the factors that are determining the ranking of verticals for any given search. So with that, I guess I'll hand it over to Max to talk about functions.
Awesome. Thanks, Alex. That is such an important feature that I am super, super excited about. One of the most important aspects of Answers is how we handle federated search across multiple different vertical types or types of content. And this just makes us, first of all, a lot smarter out of the box for how we decide which verticals are most relevant to your query. But it also gives you a lot of new kind of features at your disposal to control vertical ranking and bias towards some verticals or tweak the ranking. So I'm super excited about that. Really, really important. I want to introduce you guys to a feature called functions in query rules. This is a feature that we're really, really also excited about that kind of expands the whole realm of possibility with what you can do with Answers and with our NLP technology in general. So let me start by explaining what Yext functions are in the first place, because they're actually bigger than just Yext Answers. So Yext functions are a system of what's called serverless functions that can be run in response to various events on the Yext platform. Serverless functions are a really big and increasingly popular technology in the industry. What they basically allow you to do is write code that will run on some SaaS platform in response to certain events, but you don't have to worry about sort of what servers the code runs on or like managing any of the cloud infrastructure or all that really, cumbersome stuff. Rather, you just write the code, you worry about the business logic, and we handle kind of orchestrating, running, and triggering the function. So what are some things that Yext functions can be run in response to? One big place that Yext functions are used is in our data connector framework. So you can use Yext functions as the actual source of a data connector. You can also use them in transforms for a data connector. So you can write your own logic to fetch data. You can write your own logic to transform data. You can also use Yext functions in response to webhooks. So instead of webhooks are run in response to a variety of events on the platform. One of the most common ones is, for example, when an entity is updated. So you can associate those webhooks with a Yext function and run some code every time an entity gets updated or other things like that happen on the Yext platform. So there's a lot of different applications of functions. The one that we are newly introducing in Answers is that you can now use functions within our query rules framework. As a reminder, the query rules framework is a really powerful if this, then that framework in Yext Answers, where in response to certain events, like certain types of queries or searches that come from a certain page or data about a user, you can trigger certain actions. Like, for example, boosting an entity or a set of entities, returning the verticals in a certain order. And now an additional thing that you can do is you can run a function in response to a query rule and then forward the results back to the front end of Answers. This is a really, really powerful feature, but it's a little abstract. So I want to walk through a couple of examples and then a live demo to explain how it works. Well, a couple of places where this is particularly powerful are in situations where you want to basically make data available in your Answers experience that might not make sense to store in the Yext knowledge graph, either because it's too sensitive or because it's updated too often, or maybe because the volume of data is too high. so a couple of examples of this are, for example, imagine you're a hotel chain. And when someone says, manage my reservation or cancel my reservation, you want to surface a widget or information about their reservation in Answers. Now, it wouldn't really make sense to store every single user's reservation data in the Yext knowledge graph. That would be a really big volume of data. You'd probably run into some privacy issues. It's not really what our platform is set up to do. Using functions, you're going to be able to recognize that intent and sort of allow the user to express that intent in an answer search bar, but then fetch the data from some external service. Another great example is if you imagine you are an airline and someone asks, what time is my flight? Exact same concept. We're probably not going to store every single user in the world's flight data in the Yext knowledge graph. Rather, it would be better to sort of reach out to some external system or some external database to get that information, but then show it in the Answers results. And then the third example, which we're actually going to show you live right now, is if someone asks, for example, what's the stock price? This is stock price data, as you know, changes really, really quickly. And so it would be very challenging to store all that data in the Yext knowledge graph, but there are lots of other open services across the internet that make that data available and keep it up to date really, really quickly. So let's actually dive in on this third example, and I'll show you guys an example built using our React component library of an Answers widget that does exactly this. So I've built a super simple experience here that searches some of the data that's on the Yext investor site. So if I ask a question like who founded Yext, I get some basic FAQs back. I haven't done much to style them, but that's beside the point of this demo. But if I ask a question like, what is the price of Apple at? What I get is this really nice, clean market summary, very similar to the one that you would see on Google Finance, that shows me the high and low price of Apple shares and also a little graph here showing the trajectory of Apple. But what's really cool is that I can actually type in any ticker that I want here. I can say, what's the price of Tesla or Microsoft? And I will get a dynamic market summary that shows me all that data. Now, the way that this is working is that I've written a function using the Yext function system that hits an API called Polygon. Polygon is an API that gives you like real-time stock data. And so in response to any query that I detect as having a ticker, so a couple of like capital letters here, what we do is we hit the Polygon API to get some information about that ticker and then return it back and render it on the front end. So let's go through a quick tutorial of how you would set this up in Answers. So the first thing to understand is that plugins, functions are just a config as code resource, like many other parts of the Yext platform, such as the Answers configuration. The way that you would create one of these resources is that you would define this, what's called a resource.json file. And so you see I'm targeting this plugin schema. A plugin is just a collection of functions. So when you hear the word plugin, just think multiple functions. And then I'm going to target this mod.ts file. So all of Yext functions are written.
We're not looking at the right screen.
Oh my gosh. I am sorry about that.
That's
okay. Let's try this one more time. I feel like I mess this up every time. How's this, Jesse?
Perfect. No, it's okay. It's what makes us human. Go ahead.
Exactly. Thank you. Sorry about that. So I guess we missed the part about the resource.json file. So okay. So like I said, you'll define a resource.json config as code file. This is probably familiar to you if you've ever looked in the admin console of Yext. Lots of resources are represented as JSON files like this. But alongside your JSON file, you'll also define this TypeScript file, mod.ts. So all of the Yext functions are written in a language called TypeScript, which is just a type-safe version of JavaScript. And they are run in what's called the Dino runtime. Dino is similar to Node.js, but it has a couple of differences that aren't really relevant to this talk here.
So a couple important details. When you run a function in response to a query in Yext, you're going to have access to what's called this query payload. The query payload has all of the same information that the Yext Answers algorithm has access to when it sort of parses a query. So one example is the input of the query. So that's just the text that the user entered. But you also have access to any user-specific context. So this is just kind of arbitrary data about the user and the context of the search, which is really powerful and important. You also have access to the locale, the experience and vertical page, the refer URL that the user is on, also powerful, and also the lat long that the user is searching from. Now, based on that, you can write whatever function you want. My function here, we won't go through in super great detail, but basically what it's doing is it's taking the input of the query, looking for any tickers that it finds, and then it's hitting this Polygon API right here to get some data about that stock. So I get data for my graph, I get data about like the ticker in general, including like its image URL, and so on and so forth. What I can then do is I can apply this resource to my account and then reference it in other resources. So if I go back to my answers configuration here, this is how I would reference this resource in a query rule. So if you remember, query rules have criteria and then actions. Criteria are the if this, and actions are the then that. So I'm defining a criteria that looks for anything that looks like a ticker using regular expressions. And then I'm defining this function. So there's a new action type for functions called use function. And I'm going to reference both my function and plugin ID and also give it a key. The reason that I need a key is so that I know sort of how to reference it in my front end code, which we'll get to. And so what this is going to do is that anytime this criteria is identified by the algorithm, it's going to run this function and then return it to my front end. Then the final step is to render some data on the front end. So this is really easy to do in our new Answers Headless React library. So I'll show you an example of what my market summary component looks like. And this integrates seamlessly with the Answers React library, as well as our React Components library, which has out-of-the-box UI components. So what I do here is I use my use answers state hook to basically look for data about whether or not the search is loading. If I go to my main component, I will find what I'm looking for is this query rules section of the state. And so basically what I do is I look and in that query rules section, which is a new part of the API response that contains this data. And if I find my stock data key, then I will know to render this market summary component. And my market summary component just does some basic logic and styling using a library called recharts to render what you see here on the screen. And then the final part is that I have deployed my application right here using Yext Pages. So I can now deploy all sorts of apps and host this on Pages. And there you have it. This is sort of a simple example of how you would fetch some data using functions and query rules, and then display it using our Answers React library. So going back, I just will want to note a couple final things. This is just one example using a public API in Polygon, but there's really sort of endless ways that you could use this. The example that I showed did not even have any user-specific data, so it's not showing different users, different results based on who they are, but that's something that you could easily implement using context and using also visitor ID if you're passing one to answers. So this is really, really powerful. Like it can be used not only to tap into public APIs, but also private ones that might be specific to your business to fetch data that's specific to each user or that changes very often. We're really, really excited to see how our customers start using this feature. We think it's really, really powerful, and it kind of makes available Answers NLP capabilities and our sort of serving infrastructure, but allows you to do things other than simply fetch results from the Yext knowledge graph. So with that, I will pass it back to Jesse to wrap up.
Awesome. Thanks, Max. I'm also going to send this guide here for serverless functions and query rules from Hitchhikers in case that is helpful. And then now we're ready to take some questions. So in the bottom section, you'll see that Q&A module. Feel free to submit questions and we will take a look at those. I'll give you a few minutes to submit. But in the meantime, let's see. Okay, we have one here. So can functions be sensitive to authentication or authorization?
Yes, they definitely can. So last release, we released authorized search, which allows you to securely vary the search results based on the user's permission so that people only see the content that they are allowed to see. You can pass authorization tokens and headers to a function so that the function also displays only information that that user has permission to see.
Awesome. Here's a question for you, Alex. Can I use bias to hard code vertical orders? For example, if I want a promo vertical to always appear first.
Yeah, so that's a great question. That is a common use case that we solved for with biases. So if you'll recall, the vertical score that every vertical receives in a search is always between 0 and 1. So if you set a bias of, say, 100 on a vertical, then that vertical will always appear first. So you can definitely still use biases to essentially pin verticals to the top of the result set.
Awesome. What if I am interested in functions in query rules, but I'm not a developer?
Yeah, good question. So right now you can engage the Yext consulting team to help build specific functions for you. So we're happy to help there. Another thing that is on our roadmap for our solutions product management team is to package up functions for a couple common use cases into our app directory and make them usable without or with very little custom code or configuration. So there aren't any of those yet, but as we kind of get customers using this feature and see common use cases emerge, you can expect to see some kind of low code, no code functions that are easy to use without involvement from a developer.
Awesome, thank you. Are there any best practices around setting magnitude in biases and thresholds?
Yeah, that's a great question. The first thing I'll say is I'm pretty sure we released a Hitchhiker module for vertical ranking, which does detail, I think, this a little bit more detail. Starting with biases, I think a good practice is to set positive biases on verticals that you obviously want to favor in the search, but maybe that could be official content. That could be, content that generally leads to conversion. That's generally the cases of verticals where you would set a positive bias. And then you might want to set a negative bias on, very wordy content, for example, that you might be searching with keywords. If you have a Q&A or a forum post vertical, for example, there can be a lot of sort of random keyword matches that might return that vertical. So setting a negative bias could be a good way of handling that. I think with thresholds, generally setting a low threshold of 0.1 or 0.2 on every vertical should be good practice. If a vertical has a score of 0.1, that probably means that the algorithm thinks that vertical is not super relevant to the query, and we're only returning it because there is some sort of keyword match. In those cases, you can filter out all of that noise by setting, a baseline 0.1 or 0.2 threshold on your verticals.
Can I use phrases for vertical intents? Is one of the questions. Sorry, did you hear me, Alex? Can I use phrases as in vertical intents?
Sorry. Yes, you can. So vertical intents get handled using semantic similarity or our embeddings in the same way that we look at the name of the vertical, any filters on the vertical, and so on. So if you type a phrase as a vertical intent, like an entire question, that question gets compared semantically to the query in the same way that all those other factors do. So yes, you can absolutely use entire phrases as vertical intents.
Awesome. What about, can I still use base score to order verticals?
So for the time being, you can, but my recommendation would be, my recommendation would be you can do pretty much everything that you want to do with base score with biases and thresholds. So my recommendation would be to use those. They are more flexible tools. So if you set a positive base score, for example, on a vertical, that vertical will always appear above other verticals that don't have a base score. But bias is a lot more flexible. You know, like the example I showed, there are still cases where a vertical with a positive bias might not appear first if there's a strong enough similarity to another vertical. So the short answer to answer the question is you can still use base score. We strongly recommend that you don't, and you use these new tools instead.
Okay, awesome. Going back to functions and query rules. So can a function be applied to only a separate instance of the Yext search box? Example would be to only allow a function to apply a separate search box on a page after a customer was authenticated for an order status query, for example.
Yeah, great question. There, the answer is definitely yes. There's a couple different ways that you could accomplish this depending on how you are set up. One way would be to simply use the refer page URL, which is passed to query rules. Remember that query rules can have multiple different criteria. So you can choose one criteria to activate a function using like regular expressions or the search term, but you could choose another based on refer page URL. Another option would be to do it based on context. So if the referrer page is not enough and you need more information about the user, you could pass that in through the context object, and that gives you even more control about when a query rule is activated. But the answer is definitely yes, we can accommodate that.
Awesome. Alex, we have a question for you. Can we access the vertical user interface now? And is it available to all Yext users?
Yeah, great question. So in order to access the vertical ranking interface, you need to turn on a specific product feature, which I believe is vertical intense biases and thresholds, I think is the name of it, which as part of early access for the spring release should now be available and client settable.
Let me see if there are any other questions. Thank you everybody for submitting. We have one here about functions. How do I test that my function works?
Yeah, great question. Would you mind, Jesse, if I shared my screen really quickly to answer this one? So to test functions both for answers or any other place that you are using them in the Yext platform, we recommend using the Dino test framework. So like I said, all of our functions run in the Dino runtime. Dino has a command line tool called Dino test that allows you to run some like test cases for your functions. So here's an example of a test case that I've written for my function. And you don't even really need to write a full-blown test case. You can simply, kind of log the results and just to make sure that they're working. This is going to be the easiest way to test your functions locally before you start using them in answers, just to make sure that they work. We are working on even better tools for kind of simulating functions in different parts of the Yext platform. So stay tuned for those.
Sorry, I lost my screen there. Awesome. Okay, I think that might be all we have for questions. But thank you everybody so much for your engagement. Thank you for coming today. We're super excited about the Nebula algorithm update, as well as all of the things we've released in the spring release. So we'd love to hear your feedback, as well as any questions that you have in the Hitchhiker community. So highly encourage you to check it all out. Let us know what you think and let us know if we can help you in any way. But thanks again, and we'll talk to you all soon.